So if you're watching this video, you'll be either familiar with CPT or interested in the way of understanding cognitive functions and type as a whole in a more fluid manner. And hopefully you would have also seen a CPT Explained series. If you haven't already, check it out over here, whereby we explain cognitive functions in a more kind of dynamical manner, talking about the emergent properties, such as indeed type, that come about through the interaction of multiple functions. And so far within CPT, we've covered cognitive pairings, what happens when two functions are paired together, working in unison. Dip functions, how one function can access another function along a continuum. And more recently, gateways, where instead of representing a kind of static processing unit, a function position, so to speak, like NI dominance, represents instead a gateway into another function. And thus it is the gateway of a function that determines its kind of agenda, if you will. However, we have not yet in CPT explored how the gateways themselves can change. How a TE dominant can become more of an FE dominant, for example, instead of simply passing through TE into FE. And if you've gotten this far into the video, you're already going to be guessing this is pretty complex stuff, and I'm not going to lie, it is. Some viewers will be excited by the prospect of complexity, others will be intimidated, and others will just simply think it isn't necessarily worth the time investment. But I do want to say the beautiful thing about this particular system is as soon as you get the fundamentals, you can actually figure out everything yourself, because it all works upon general laws you can apply from one area into another one. So consider it a kind of upfront investment to make everything more easeful going into the future. While CPT is compatible with other systems, in order to get on board with what I'm going to be telling you in this video, you are going to have to leave a few things behind, or at least put them on a shelf for now. And more than anything, we need to move on from the, in my opinion, outdated notion that personality traits, which is what they are, such as being a sensor or intuitive type, correspond to a person's underlying cognition. So here is a quick breakdown of how functions are understood within this model, and I do highly recommend watching this bit because if you skip ahead, you're probably going to be confused. The cognitive functions that you understand in MBTI terms, extroverted sensing, for example, are actually viewed as cognitive elements within CPT. And these cognitive elements are redundant when alone. A rational element is blind, and a perceptual element is devoid of reason, hence why Jung called that function, or element in this case, irrational. And if you want to understand more about the nature of rational versus irrational functions, I definitely recommend going back and reading a bit of Jung, specifically his work in psychological types. So within CPT, cognitive elements work in pairs in order to combine into an actual cognitive function. For example, extroverted sensing, when adjoined to extroverted thinking, is an interobjective framework employing a very precise and focused external lens. The extroverted sensing element is the narrow scope here, constraining reality in order to render it both intense and tangible, whereas the extroverted thinking element is the objective agenda, assigning value based upon definable characteristics, often semantic in nature. So when these two elements form together, they become functional, hence a function. A cognitive pairing is after all able to both perceive and rationalize upon that which is perceived. And one of these elements within this pairing is an auxiliary element, therefore performing an assistive role to the dominant element. And this is why in CPT, the auxiliary faces the same direction as the dominant, because they are operating in a pairing. Just as two cognitive elements form together into a cognitive function, two cognitive functions form together into a cognitive network. And a cognitive network at face value does look like your run-of-the-mill MBTI type. A perceiving and rational element facing one direction, and a perceiving and rational element facing the other direction. But there are two very important distinctions. First of all, in CPT, an element comes about through the entanglement of opposites. Two cognitive pairings locked in a state of opposition while simultaneously giving birth to one another. A cool analogy to use here to understand a type within CPT is a battery. You have a positive end and a negative end. Shout out to Jaden on the CPT Patreon for that cool example. The convergent pairing is like a dominant pairing. It is the realm where we rest our ego and exert much of our will and effort. Think of the TENE pairing of an ESTJ. Intense, isn't it? The divergent pairing by contrast is the realm of the outer ego. As a result, this function, that's right, singular, is much more static. So static and immovable, in fact, that it's kind of scary. This immovable object is therefore one we tend to observe more than act upon. often instilling an authoritative, or parental, if you will, influence upon the convergent pairing. So the second distinction between CPT and other systems is what happens outside of this bare bones cognitive network. And this is where we get into the meat and potatoes of the video. So far on the channel I've talked a lot about dip functions. Rather than shadow functions as used in other systems, dip functions within CPT represent a way to travel from one function into another one. It's all about mobility here. Functions within CPT are therefore on fluid continuums. If you can broaden your scope with extroverted intuition, it only makes sense that you can also constrain your scope with extroverted sensing. If you can objectify your internal frameworks with introverted thinking, it only makes sense that you can also subjectify them with introverted feeling. It is not this either-or thing. Yes, some dip functions are more developed than other ones, but there is nothing really shadowy about CPT. So yeah, we can dip along to other functions willy-nilly, but that's not all we do. Understanding a type within CPT pertains to also understanding the networks within a type that occur outside of starting position. Those of you already familiar with the pairings and dip functions of CPT therefore already know that an ISTP, for example, dips along from TINI into FISI. Accordingly, they also dip into TENE. Thus, this type, via interaction with more proximate functions, already shares two other cognitive networks, referred to as ESTJ and INFP within MBTI. A type within CPT is therefore much more than a static map of interlocking functions dipping in and out of each other at many times a nanosecond. Oh right, that does bring me to another good point. Cognition is faster than consciousness. So when we are describing using a function, we are in actuality just referring to a higher frequency of oscillations in that cognitive direction. A type here is not defined as how good you are at X over Y, or even how much you're using one function over another one. Instead, a type within our system here is the point of origin and return. Alpha and omega, if you will. We've already used ISTP as an example, so let's pick a native network from that type and make it primary. An INFP primary network, loosely referred to as an INFP, also has some networks accessible from primary position. You can refer to these as dip networks. TINI and FESE are easily accessible from within the starting continuum. Ergo, the INFP has dip types of ENFJ and ISTP. And since these networks are so native to the primary cognitive map, you can actually understand these as dominant networks. So far you're probably with me because it's very similar to the whole four sides of the mind thing, just explained in a more mechanistic manner. So dip functions are actually pretty easy to get on board with. They make a kind of intuitive sense. We have four dominant networks in the type that you can essentially get to by flipping functions upside down in the case of FISI, FESE, or flipping the type on its axis, TENE, or combining them both together to get TINI. And the reason these are called dip networks is because they do not necessitate the rotating of cognitive gateways. That is, an INFP can dip into ENFJ while retaining an FI origin point. To go any further than this, though, we do have to consider the possibility of gateways themselves changing. Would an INFP's rational elements always be operating from a kind of FI-TE origin point? Or would FI instead sometimes be to the agenda of TI rather than itself? This does not have to be the case, of course, but the purpose of CPT is not to arbitrarily prescribe how things are, but simply lay down the mechanisms through which things can be. And in doing so, we create a model that can account for the variance outside of type, and therefore measure and understand type as something entirely more fluid. Which brings us to the final stage of the video. I want to talk about auxiliary networks. As I was just saying, these are more hypothetical, but after hundreds upon hundreds of case studies, I can no longer really turn a blind eye to what I'm saying time and time again. So irrespective of whether you subscribe to this idea, auxiliary networks do represent the final missing piece of the CPT picture. So the cognitive elements we were describing so far do represent the positions in a cognitive map. Within CPT we have dominant, agency, authority, and oppositional positions. So let's say we have 8 potential cognitive elements for each of our 4 primary gateways. 8 for dominant, 8 for agency, 8 for authority, and 8 for oppositional. And that is 32 elements in total. And the first 4 are pretty easy because they are already there. Let's use INTP as an example. TISI, FE, NE, the dominant pairing and the opposing pairing. Now let's rotate the axis. It becomes FENE in dominant position and TISI in oppositional position. Cool, so now let's explore the dip networks within the dominant meta-network of this type. Well, TISI dips along into FINI, and FENE dips along into TESE. So we have FINI and TESE. This would be called an ISFP network. And now again, let's flip the axis. Now you have an ENTJ network. So far we've got 8 different cognitive elements, all of which have taken a turn at being in a different position. And all of this was just using 4 cognitive functions, that is CPT pairings. But CPT states that we can go further than this, that type is not only fluid around a center, but also across networks. But naturally, the further we go from the center, the more cognitive resistance we encounter. And you can understand this as cognitive magnetism to the origin point. But let's keep pushing against this cognitive resistance and see how far we get in our network journey. It's time to explore the auxiliary networks. So if there's one cognitive element strong and compulsive enough to interchange with the dominant element, what do you think it would be? One that is flexible, dynamic, durable enough to handle such resulting stress. And yes, we are talking about the classic auxiliary function of MBTI, the authority element in CPT. And this is actually kind of ironic because I've never really referred to this as an auxiliary before in this model. The auxiliary for me, for example, as an INFJ is TI rather than FE. And so with some level of happiness, I can say I finally found a compelling reason to refer to this as auxiliary, just not in the sense it's often used as. So while CPT does not recognize the authority function as auxiliary to the dominant, that is FE, for example, within an INFJ, it does yet represent a kind of gateway through which we can access our auxiliary networks. So let's keep running with the INTP. Maybe you can entertain the idea of an INTP having a kind of NE dominant side. But we have to explore, what would that NE dominant be? ENTP, ENFP? Well, let's use a CPT attitudes to assess the points of relative flexibility and inflexibility within this cognitive map. What is the least flexible position? That is the one that is hyperdivergent. While INTPs can be pushed into a corner to go into an ESFJ state, albeit briefly, oftentimes, they will often be damned if they're going to render FE hyperconvergent, such as the case of the ENTP. Flipping a function into its opposite attitude is pretty much the most extreme you can get. That hardly sounds like a native network to me. Practically speaking, when a function is more aversive by its nature, rendering it kind of chaotic is a big ask. I mean, sure, we can do it. We can do lots of things, but not in a way that is native. But on the other hand, what about extroverted thinking for such an agency position? Well, extroverted thinking within this type is already subdominant and therefore comfortable in convergence. And introverted feeling is already divergent within this type. Rendering an element that you are used to observing blind is another big ask. But rendering it authoritative, on the other hand, is pretty easy. It was already semi-authoritative to begin with. Ever wondered why ENFPs seem to have this analytical INTP streak? And INTPs, when you know them well enough, seem to have this goofy ENFP streak? Well, now you have a theoretical model to explain why that's happening. So we have NETE for an INTP. And now let's, once again, flip the axis. Now we have an SIFI dominant pairing and an NETE opposing pairing. And this one shouldn't be too surprising. We're talking about an ISTJ. And it actually gives a lot of justification for the pretty constant ISTJ into INTP mistype. And it also explains why INTPs seem to be pretty consistently able to calmly assess the safety factor of an extensive NETE external landscape. But what about SITI instead? Why SIFI and not SITI? Well, generally INTPs are too busy building and distilling their knowledge banks. They typically do not have the patience for that kind of careful SITI refinement process of the ISFJ. A refining process that is akin to a sculptor upon a beautiful statue. Personally, I have not noticed a lot of SITI from INTPs, nor TISI from ISFJs. It would be happening, but not as much as what we've just been talking about. So let's keep going with these pairings we've just found, that is NETE and SIFI. Now all we have to do is apply the dip mechanic to these pairings. So what happens when SIFI dips along the extension gateway of CPT? Well, that becomes NITI. What about the opposing pairing? Well, NETE dips into SEFE. Interesting. Now we've accounted for the consistent mistyping between INTP and INFJ. Also explains why INTPs seem to be so consistently these kind of staunch, meta-analytical humanitarians with strong political opinions. Not a rule, but definitely a trend I've noticed. But what about NIFI, that is introverted feeling instead of introverted thinking as the agency position? Well, as I've already alluded to, INTPs already have FINI, that is an ISFP network, in droves and can happily transform. But actually locking an archetype into agency position, such as in the case of the INTJ, or even projecting themselves into the future to know how they will feel, or even embracing a sense of destiny as you embark on a set direction and accept all that you might lose out on in the process. These things could be much more of a struggle for this type. But what happens when the aforementioned SIFI dips along into the expression gateway into SEFE? Or we can just flip the axis of the INFJ. Either way, we're looking at an ESTP network. And this makes a lot of sense. It certainly explains all of the ESTP-INTP mistyping that tends to occur. Seriously, so many ESTPs mistype as INTP, it's not even funny. And I will admit, prior to CPT, I was doing some of that mistyping myself, misidentifying ESTPs as INTPs and vice versa. So there we have it. Not only have we explored the dominant networks, but we've also explored the auxiliary networks as well. And you can apply this to other types too. And if you've found this video interesting, I'll be more than happy to release type-specific videos fully unpacking all of the networks, including the tertiary and inferior networks. Yes, you have heard me right. I've finally found an authentic way to be able to bring back the terms tertiary and inferior. So rather than the tertiary function, referring to what is known within CPT as the agency function, that is TI within an INFJ, for example, it now refers to an entire network. It becomes plural. So types can now be understood to have tertiary networks. Similarly, types can now have inferior networks as well. I mean, in the future I might come up with a better name for them, but in the meantime I am kind of experiencing a warm, fuzzy satisfaction with being able to bring these terms back into CPT. I mean, in my personal case, I swear, SETE, NIFI, SITI, NEFE, these pairings tend to be the bane of my existence, but nonetheless a very important growth point in my own individuation journey. By contrast, TENE, SIFI, TINI, FESE, certainly not native to my cognition, but very much tertiary in nature. So that's the end of the video. I've just given you a massive CPT explosion, and I highly recommend sitting back, letting it sit with you a bit before clicking that rewatch button. I remember debuting CPT Network Theory to the Patreon crowd a year ago, and since then it's still exciting many minds, and many people are still trying to wrap their heads around it, including myself. But that does bring us to the end of the video. If you know anyone who you think might find it useful, insightful, or generally just enjoy the intellectual juggling act of cognitive networks, I do recommend sharing it with them. And if you would like to know more about your own cognitive networks, individual to you, I highly recommend getting in touch with me via the CPT coaching service, which you can find on cognitivepersonality.com. And I do want to give a big shout out to the entire Patreon crowd for continuing to fund CPT's theoretical development. It is thanks to your support that we have made it this far. And if anyone watching here is also interested in supporting the continued development of CPT, I do recommend checking out the Patreon page. And of course, I'm already grateful to the entire subscriber base of CPT too. We're over 30,000 subscribers now, we're growing strong, and honestly I feel like the journey is just beginning. So that's it for me, and I'll be back in about a month's time. For now, take care.